Welcome back to the Target No One Sees podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Choi. I'm a board-certified ER doctor, and today we're going to talk about the curious case of fever and why our treatment of it in medicine is completely different from our understanding of it. Stay tuned till the end, and I'll explain how you can benefit from this discrepancy and perhaps use it to improve your overall health. Now, before we dive in, let me stress once again that this is not personalized medical advice, so please consult a healthcare provider before making any treatment decisions. Now, you may have had the experience of being in a hospital with a fever, or maybe even just calling your primary doctor, asking them what to do about a fever. And their recommendation almost certainly included, take some Tylenol or Motrin to bring the fever down. And this probably made sense to you because fever is a bad thing, right? It is a bad thing, right? Well, if you believe that, what I'm about to tell you may surprise you. Fever is not a bad thing. It's not even a good thing. It's a great thing. The fever may signal that there is a serious infection present, but the fever itself is a healthy and beneficial response. Now, I actually have to apologize because I promised that the viewpoints expressed on this podcast would be heterodox in nature. And this take on fever is really only heterodox or radical in the sense that it is the opposite of what we do in daily practice. In terms of what we know and have known for over a century, this is very much just a recitation of some boring, dusty old truth. Let me tell you a story. So, in 1927, this guy right here, Austrian physician Julius Wagner Jauregg, won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his treatment of syphilis patients. Now, as a bit of background, syphilis today is pretty easily treated with penicillin. But this was the pre-antibiotic era. Alexander Fleming wouldn't discover penicillin until 1928, and it wouldn't become widely available for treatment until 1945. So back in the day, if you got syphilis and it spread to the brain, well, that was a wrap. In fact, that's how Al Capone died of neurosyphilis while imprisoned in Alcatraz. But Wagner Jauregg was able to cure his patients of syphilis, and the way that he did this was by giving them malaria. That is wild, right? That's like the kind of thing that Dr. John Thackeray would do in the TV show The Nick, which is a great show, by the way. But Wagner Jauregg hypothesized that the high fever that is characteristic of malaria would kill the treponema organisms that cause syphilis. And then once the syphilis was cured, he could give them quinine to cure the malaria, because they had that capacity at that time. Now, this is not an experiment that you could ever do today, nor should you, for obvious ethical reasons. And speaking of ethics, it turns out that Wagner Jauregg was not a very good guy. It seems he had some strong opinions about the Jews. But he was right about fever. And I don't know about you, but I would feel sheepish if my medical opinions in the year 2022 weren't at least as evolved as those of a rabid anti-Semite from the 1920s. All of this is simply to say that we've known for a very long time that fever is our friend. And it's no accident, it's not unique to humans. Just look around the animal kingdom. Every mammal on Earth develops a fever in response to infection. Even some fish get fevers. And there are some cold-blooded vertebrates, reptiles, that while they can't regulate their body temperature in the same way, they engage in something called behavioral fever. So in response to an infection, they'll actually behave in a manner that raises their body temperature so that they can help fight the infection. Now, the thing about a fever is it's very metabolically expensive. It requires a lot of energy to turn the furnace up. So you burn a ton of calories just running a fever. Now, none of these animals that I mentioned that evolved to have fevers evolved in environments where food was always in abundance. Historically, food has always been scarce and thus stored calories precious. So having something programmed into your genes that burned up these stored calories without a very good reason would never have withstood natural selection in a single species, much less all the ones I'm talking about right now. Something so wasteful would have been snuffed out like that. So why do we do this? Why do we have this attitude about fever that feels kind of antiquated, like it's straight out of the Dark Ages? Remember some of the goofy things we used to believe? Like the reason why Uncle Alphonsus is sick is because he had the wrong combination of humors in his body. We used to burn women at the stake as witches for the chilling and deviant practices now known as midwifery and herbal medicine. Now, frantically trying to expunge a fever in the year 2022 might not be quite as antiquated, but let's just say it's not humanity at its best. I think most docs know perfectly well that fever is a positive thing, but then those same docs will treat the fever anyway. Why does this happen? Well, I think in large part it's because institutions, like people, develop habits, and these habits can be hard to break. And the treatment of fever in the institution of medicine has been a habit for a very long time. Also, sometimes in medicine, there's a tendency to treat a number. What this means is if there's an abnormal vital sign or lab value, we immediately try to fix that instead of focusing on the root of the problem. It's as if each abnormality that rears its ugly head must be smacked down with extreme prejudice. It's like a weird little game. It kind of reminds me of something. Look how excited he is. I think he's having more fun than me. Also, we want to make patients feel better. And when you treat a fever, you're going to alleviate some of the symptoms that come along with that fever, like the chills and the body aches and the fatigue. And yeah, you'll make that person more comfortable. But at what cost? What do you lose by treating the fever? You see, fever doesn't just have the potential to kill microbes like treponema. Take rhinovirus, for example. This is one of the causes of the common cold. A fever drastically reduces the rate at which this virus replicates in your body. Also, fever acts like an air raid siren. It tells parts of your immune system to turn on and activate and get ready for a fight. Now, I want you to imagine this silly little scenario. You're at the gym, and you run into your doctor. Oh, hey, Doc, how you doing? I didn't know you came to this gym. Oh, hello, Kenny. Good to see you. Yes, I'm here every day. Right on, man. All right. You start your workout, you're on the treadmill, and you're booking it. It's hard, but you feel good. And then all of a sudden, your treadmill shuts off. And you look down and you see that your doctor has pulled the plug from the wall. Hey, Doc. What gives, man? What's this all about? Well, I was walking by your treadmill and I saw on the monitor that your heart rate was 160 and you were breathing 40 times a minute. These are not normal vital signs. Yeah, because I was in the middle of a workout. And you were sweating profusely and you just seemed uncomfortable. I couldn't very well sit there and do nothing, so I stepped in. Lucky for you, I intervened. You're welcome, son. Yeah, you should probably do something with that. Yeah, thanks, Doc. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. I bet you didn't know this was going to turn into mediocre sketch comedy. I think you get the point, though. Doing something is obviously good for yourself, as working out is going to invariably produce abnormal vital signs. It's going to produce physical exam findings that, under a different context, would be very concerning, like profuse sweating, or what we call diaphoresis. Because of course it will. Right? And fever is the exact same thing. It's essentially an abnormal vital sign. And this is why getting rid of fever without considering its function feels kind of short-sighted. And as a doctor, I don't want to keep my patients from doing something good for themselves. Now, a counter-argument that I sometimes get from other doctors is, well, if the cause of the fever is something serious, they're going to need some other kind of treatment or medication anyway. And if it's not serious, they're probably going to get better whether or not to treat the fever. Okay, I mean, it's not my favorite line of thinking, but it's not completely wrong either. But in 2020, sometime around March, something happened to kind of turn that argument on its head. I'm speaking, of course, of the pandemic. Now, SARS-CoV-2 is an extremely sophisticated virus, and it appears to have devoted a lot of evolutionary attention to getting around the initial wave of your immune response. This is the innate immune response. This is responsible for everything from triggering a fever to activating natural killer cells which respond to an infection. Now, the linchpin of this initial immune response, the innate immune response, is something called interferon. This is a signaling molecule. And SARS-CoV-2 has not one, not two, but 3 different proteins that are tasked with knocking out the interferon system. Obviously, I'm kind of anthropomorphizing here, but it is as if the virus realizes that an all-out assault on interferon is a key to victory. And this is what we saw during the pandemic. It was strange. With something like the flu, you reliably get a high fever. With influenza, you'll see temperatures of 103, 104. It's not uncommon. But with COVID, you saw this sluggish, lethargic fever response. People were coming in with low-grade fever, sometimes no fever at all. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who didn't have a good fever response were the ones who were going to come back later gravely ill. And remember, early on in this period, we didn't have a lot of accepted treatment options like monoclonal antibodies to help treat people in the early stages of the disease. SARS-CoV-2 was short-circuiting the innate immune response. Now, the second wave of your immune system, the adaptive immune response, This is the part that makes the antibodies. This happens later, like 5 to 7 days later. So for that 5 to 7 days, in people who were susceptible to severe COVID, the virus was replicating and replicating, pretty much unencumbered. And this is partly why they became very ill. You see, the innate immune response is strongest in little children. And as you get older, it gradually wanes. So the people with the weakest innate immune responses typically are the elderly. And these are the people who can least afford to lose whatever innate immune response they were going to have with something like SARS-CoV-2. So the question is, if you have somebody who's older who has a weakened innate immune response and they have COVID, and you give them something to take away whatever fever they were able to muster, are you making it worse for them? Now, while this is a hard question to ask, the thinking is still very much in line with what we know about other things like vaccines, for example. Now, when you take a vaccine for anything, if you also take Motrin or Advil for those symptoms related to the vaccine, you actually reduce the immunity that you get from that vaccine. This is why we tell patients, look, if you're miserable, sure, you can take something. But generally, try to avoid taking medications like Motrin and Advil for those garden variety vaccine-related symptoms. So the thinking here with treating a fever in an actual infection like COVID shouldn't be that radical. Also, I'm not saying that I never treat fever. There are definitely situations where I will treat it in a patient, but it's always a decision. I'm always weighing the benefits and risks of giving that medication. So, for example, one group that often gets treated in the ER is babies, children. And for one, because they have strong innate immune systems, but also because something that sometimes happens to babies and little children when they get a fever is they have something called a febrile seizure. And while that sounds scary, a simple febrile seizure is almost always a benign thing. It's not serious. However, to a parent who has never seen one, it is extremely shocking and traumatizing, and they run into the ER sobbing and they think that their kid is very ill. And we want to generally spare them that kind of trauma. Also, if somebody comes in, for example, for a kidney infection, and I'm giving them an antibiotic to treat the kidney infection and it's the right antibiotic, well, then I can afford to give them something like Tylenol to treat their fever and the other symptoms that go along with it and make them more comfortable, because I'm addressing the root of the problem. Now, maybe you're wondering, does this guy take his own advice? What do I do when I get a viral infection, a flu-like illness? Well, not only do I not take anything to bring the fever down, I take it a step further. I'll try to give myself a fever, meaning I'll take a hot bath for 20 to 30 minutes and do that once or twice a day during the course of the illness. How do I know you can do this? Cheat your way into a fever? Well, as it turns out, the effect of a simulated fever on the immune system is being studied. In this paper from the Journal of Human Kinetics from 2013, they looked at the effect of a single Finnish sauna session on both athletes and untrained individuals, testing their blood before and after. And what they found was, after a single sauna session, that certain white blood cell populations rose significantly, particularly what we call lymphocytes. And I should add that certain diseases, COVID in particular, seems very adept at suppressing your lymphocyte counts, probably as a means to get around the innate immune system, as we discussed before. Simulated fever, like from sauna or hydrotherapy, that is, hot bath, increases these white blood cells. It also stimulates other white blood cells, like monocytes, to basically be more active and alert against threats. Also, you may have heard the term heat shock proteins. Heat shock proteins are made by your body in response to a heat stress, like from sauna. These are basically protective molecules. They shepherd or shield the sensitive parts of your cells from damage by heat. We used to think that this is all they did. But as it turns out, they actually have an immune role as well. They perform what's called an antigen-presenting function. They basically take little bits and pieces of invading microbes and show them to your immune system and say, hey, look out for this guy. Almost like a house cat that's hunted down some little critter in your yard, brings it back to you, and to your horror, drops it at your feet. This is just another way that simulated fever strengthens the immune system. As you can probably tell, I'm a huge fan of sauna. I think it is absolutely one of the best things that you can do for your overall health. And today I just wanted to touch on it as it pertains to the immune system, but we'll do another episode in greater detail later. In the meantime, if you haven't followed Dr. Rhonda Patrick, I'm a huge fan of hers. She's exceptionally bright and knowledgeable, particularly on the subject of sauna. And she was actually recently interviewed on the Medcram podcast. They did a deep dive on sauna, and I thought it was great. I highly recommend it. I've included the link in the description below. So in closing, the takeaways. First, fever, while it can indicate that you have an infection, and that infection could be inconsequential or it could be very serious, but the fever itself is a healthy and beneficial thing. The fever helps fight the infection directly through the high temperatures, kind of being bad for the microbes that are infecting you, but it also stimulates your immune system to help it respond maximally. And simulating a fever through sauna or hydrotherapy has the potential to not only fight active infections, but strengthen the immune system against future infections, and lastly, has great potential benefits for overall health in general. So that's it. Enjoy your week, guys. Take care. Thank you for joining us. This has been the Target No One Sees podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please like, subscribe, and share. Future episodes will include a better way to look at antibiotics, problems with our current vaccine strategy, and unresolved questions about early sleep training for infants. In each of these cases, coming at it with a heterodox approach. So I'm Dr. Michael Choi. I'll talk to you soon.